Ladies and gentlemen, an honor to have here with us, and we see her frequently on MSNBC. She's an MSNBC and NBC News legal analyst, by the way, and also professor at the New School, Maya Wiley. Good to see you, Maya.
Good to see you, Mark.
Hey, thank you for coming in
It's a
to see us.
And your locks are looking much better than mine today. Your viewers can't see that, but I can.
Your locks always look regal and magnificent, so you're good. You're good. It's interesting. I remember when folk who had hair like ours weren't even allowed on television. That was like, and people would judge. They would see our hair more than hear what we said. So
Yes.
how times have changed, haven't they?
Thankfully.
And that wasn't that long ago, to be
No.
honest with you.
And a lot of black women on MSNBC with natural hair
Right.
of different styles.
That's right.
Which
That's
is
right.
another thing we never thought we would
never
necessarily
thought would
see.
happen. So, thank you for that. So here we are, articles of impeachment going over. The trial in the Senate likely to start next week, I believe.
Correct.
First of all, how would you grade or critique Pelosi's, the Speaker's, handling of this? Did you think it was prudent for her to withhold the articles as long as she did?
I do, and I think that's been borne out by what we're seeing now, which is senators, Republican senators, including Mitt Romney, even Lisa Murkowski, Susan Collins, saying that they need to consider witnesses. That's very different, by the way, from a commitment. They've hedged their bets by saying, let's hear from the House managers first. But there's no question that the more she let the issue hang out there for the public to consider, for the additional facts that we saw came forward in news reports over the holidays, including that, that Secretary Bolton, National Security Advisor Bolton, had a meeting with Trump in September, begging him to release Ukrainian funds that we didn't previously know about. That, from the fact that Bolton himself now has said, despite refusing to come and testify before the House, that he would be willing, if subpoenaed, to testify before the Senate. Those things made it a lot harder for Republican senators to hold the line on just turning out the lights on the details of what happened in the Ukraine scandal. So I think her holding them back created the space for that additional information, for that movement, and also, for the public to catch up to the news.
Yeah.
It's really unfair for us who get to participate in every day
Right.
to think that the public working hard every day, some people working 2-3 jobs, kids, elderly parents they're taking care of, it takes a while for them to necessarily catch up with all the facts that we have the privilege of looking at every day. And I think that's why we're seeing polls that say 71% of independents and 39% of Republicans think there should be witnesses called, not to mention basically all of Democrats. That's pretty much most of the country, of much more than 50%.
Well, speaking of people catching up, I wonder if you've had this experience I've had. You and I might do an appearance on television, but then people will still contact us and ask us to explain what's going on and what we were talking about. I mean, you're right.
Absolutely.
Because, we kind of sleep, eat, and drink this. In fact, I rarely sleep
Yeah.
because I'm taking it all in. But you're right. The average person, it's a little bit difficult to follow sometimes.
Absolutely. And also, when we're doing segments on television, the great thing about this medium is that we can go longer and deeper.
Yeah.
So if people have the time to listen, they can process it more. Television's very fast. It's very short. It's very brief. The segments are 3 minutes to 8 minutes. And you're trying to pack in a lot of information for the public in a very, very short set of sound bites. And I think for that reason, and rightly so, people say, all right, I definitely heard some things I'm interested in. Tell me more.
Yeah.
I shop in the grocery store. I ride the subway. I walk down the streets of my neighborhood, and I get stopped all the time by people saying, I'm so appreciative you make it plain, but tell me this. Is it the case that the president is still impeached if they acquit him in the Senate? These are good questions, and there's no reason for people to necessarily know the answer.
Right.
And they matter, particularly if they're wondering how much should I worry as a citizen of this country if our Republican senators stonewall witnesses.
Right.
How much should I worry? And the answer is he'll be impeached no matter what. He will always carry that badge. But we should, at minimum, know everything that happened here.
Mm-hmm.
We deserve it as an American people. We deserve it because that's the way the Constitution wrote it. It's what the founders intended. And how do you have a democracy if you don't have the light of day?
Yeah, that's right. Maya, you mentioned what the founders intended. So looking at this, and I admit I didn't do this during Clinton's impeachment, but we know the Constitution has flaws.
Yeah, I think we of all people
we of all people know
flaws.
that, right? So as we look at this now, isn't it a little bit flawed, the impeachment, if not the impeachment, the removal process, where senators really have total control? The Chief Justice is really barely a moderator in the process. He can't really make a lot of decisions. Senators can be of the jury, really a jury. But then you have McConnell, who can also say in the same breath, well, I'm coordinating with the White House counsel. So it seems to me even the process of removal is somewhat imperfect.
Yeah, I don't think it is a perfect process by any stretch of the imagination. I think the founders understood, if you read any of the Federalist Papers, particularly if the three primary founders to follow on impeachment are Mason, mm-hmm. Madison, and Hamilton, two slave owners and one who at least did some work against slavery in New York.
Right.
The interesting thing about that is they make very clear and they debate the tensions in both impeachment as something that exists in the Constitution. Not that they thought it shouldn't exist. They were very clear they had to have a check and balance on the presidency that happened before the next election cycle if somebody really deserved it, if it was really too damaging to the country. And in fact, most of the states, most of the colonies, remember they were colonies.
They were colonies, that's right.
They were colonies. All of them had some form of impeachment clause, I think, and two of them not necessarily permitting removal, but all had some form of process that enabled the removal of elected officials before the end of their term and before the next election. And so there wasn't really a question of whether they were going to have one and whether a democracy needed one, because, of course, they knew they had to protect against the development of a monarchy. But they talked about the tensions of this being a political process, that by definition it was going to be political, and that political parties would vie to protect their person. And so their concept of splitting the responsibilities between the House and the Senate essentially was their way of trying to create some balance in that political process, the House being much more raucous. The other thing, though, that I've learned actually from this process from historians is that initially senators were appointed. They weren't elected. So they have Senate has always been seen, and even with elected senators has been somewhat more of the more slow-moving, judicious of the two houses of Congress. But this, is still partisan politics. I will say that it's very hard to think of a system that completely removes that, and I think whether or not you gave the judiciary some more powers in it would be one, but you'd have to amend the Constitution.
Yeah.
The Constitution's very clear. It cedes sole authority to the House for charging impeachment and the Senate for trying and making a decision of whether to convict and remove. So I would say that what we should focus on, at least for this impeachment process, which really goes back to the central question we're talking about today, is witnesses and documents, is full evidence. Mm-hmm. To me, the biggest concern is not necessarily that it's political and partisan, not that that's a happy thing for any lawyer who wants a full, fair, and impartial process. It's that if a president can block the witnesses and the documents from the light of day, it means that you can't even have the hope of taking a partisan process and making it more rational. Because remember, in most impeachments, this is what happened with Richard Nixon. Republicans were circling the wagons and protecting him. They were even protecting his executive privilege claims on some of what he was holding back. He didn't hold back all the evidence, by the way, as Donald Trump has. He was more cooperative than Trump has been. But he tried to hold back the most damaging evidence and bar it from public view. Lost that fight, obviously, with this famous Supreme Court decision, U.S. versus Nixon. But the thing is, once the Republicans heard the tape, the Watergate tape, once they heard his voice on that tape, they turned on him and said, "You've got to go. You either resign or be impeached."
Right.
And the difference here is the Republican Party is not taking seriously that there's the evidence that's already in the public light is very scary.
It is.
And the fact that we have a political process right now that is much more mired in partisanship than it would have been in the 70s. Not that it was easy in the 70s, but that there was some sense of norms that you couldn't protect your own candidate around if they violated them. And I think the thing that is so damaging about Donald Trump's presidency is he's violating so many of our values and our norms as people, as a country, as a polity, that that's really, I think, part of why this isn't working the way it should, because there really should be no question on the part of the Republicans in the Senate. If there are no witnesses, it's not a trial.
Right, it's not a real trial. Also, in the 70s, they didn't have the protection of a 24-hour basic cable propaganda station.
That's absolutely right.
I mean, and to be very honest, to be very specific, Roger Ailes created that network because of Watergate. That network exists for this very moment, as if he knew that other Republicans would face impeachment. No surprise to most of us. That's kind of the nature. So witnesses, documents. In the span of time that Speaker Pelosi has held their articles, so to speak, we have seen Bolton come forward. And obviously there were other witnesses. He's the only one that says.
He's the only one.
The only one that said he's willing to come forward. Mm-hmm. There are other documents. Could have, should have, the House, when he gave the signal, he would ask a Senate subpoena. Should they have called for the question? So wait a minute. Why don't we just do a House subpoena right now and get you in here even before we send the articles? Should that maybe have happened?
Yeah, I am a longstanding person on TV who has been saying from the beginning, subpoena everybody.
Right.
So don't hold the subpoenas back just because they're refusing to testify. I understand the theory behind it and the politics of it. So I'm not. I have a lot of respect for Nancy Pelosi, and rational minds can differ. There are two reasons why I think they should have been aggressive on day one around actual subpoenas.
And this is while the hearings were still going on.
And this is why the hearings were still going on, right? When Bolton, remember, originally Bolton's lawyer says, send us a subpoena. Right? They asked him to come in and testify, which is the standard procedure. You ask witnesses to come forward. If they won't, then you subpoena them. They asked him to come. He said no. His lawyer said, but send us a subpoena, which seemed to indicate that if he was subpoenaed, he would feel that he had the legal cover he needed from Donald Trump arguing that he should not, that this evidence should not be coming before the House. I, for one, saw that as a signal that he was going to, if subpoenaed, testify. But then his lawyer said, if you subpoena us, we will sue you. Something happened in that day or two between that statement and then his saying, no, we'll litigate this. Democrats didn't want to litigate. They didn't want to slow the process. They thought it would serve the Republican talking points. I thought it was important as a lawyer and as a constitutionalist, because in every impeachment we've had, we've gotten critical statements from the Supreme Court about the balance of powers, about Congress's ability to have oversight over a sitting president. Those precedents matter, particularly if you have a party that is refusing to play fair. And in this case, the Republicans have not been playing fair. So that's one reason. Now, fast forward and say, okay, but they didn't, and there was enough evidence. I'm with them on that. even without Bolton's testimony or without McDuffie or any of the long list of witnesses that haven't testified. But now that Bolton has said that he will testify in the Senate, he's essentially conceded that if subpoenaed by the House, he doesn't really have a good argument, which he never did, by the way. He never had a good argument for not complying with the subpoena. But he certainly can't publicly say he has a good reason now. And I think, again, they can then go and use their prerogative to litigate it, but I also think he may come testify. I think it matters, as I've said, and I'm going to say it over and over again to anybody who will listen, whether or not Donald Trump is convicted and removed, it absolutely matters that we get the light of day on what happened in Ukraine. It absolutely matters. Donald Trump has demonstrated that he will say what he thinks is useful to him, which has very little to do with the facts. And the American people should, if nothing else, have the ability to make a fully informed decision when they elect the next president.
So he says, I will accept a subpoena from the Senate. If you were in the House or if you were advising the Speaker, you would say, okay, well, let's do it. Let's do it now.
This.
And you're right. He couldn't very well say, well, no to the House. And if he did, he would kind of, tip his hand, because there's some speculate maybe we shouldn't trust John Bolton in the first place. We don't know what he's really going to say.
We need the documents too. So it's not just Bolton. We need all the documents in his possession. They need to fight about the subpoena for documents from the exchanges, because as we've seen, when we get the documents, it's also harder for people to say things that are not true.
That's right.
Just remember Gordon Sondland, who had to change his testimony.
That's right.
And then when he testified after his deposition, had to say, I still haven't seen all my emails. There may be things I'm forgetting. So it is really important to have those documents, both to hold people to account to the truth.
Right.
But also to know what happened, right? We're not trying to, it's not a getcha. It's not we're not trying to trap anybody. People should have their memories refreshed by the actual documents. We all do.
Yeah, the transparency
Absolutely.
on that. So again, we're not necessarily sure of what he might actually say.
We only know what we do. The tantalizing tidbit that his lawyer dropped out there was, and that he dropped out there, is he's got a lot of information. And there was certainly the suggestion that it's not so favorable to Donald Trump. And based on the testimony of witnesses like Fiona Hill about her conversations with John Bolton, things like, I don't want any part of this drug deal, and Rudy Giuliani is a hand grenade. From everything we've heard from other witnesses who spoke directly to John Bolton, we would expect that there would be some negative things in that, and that is exactly why Donald Trump doesn't want witnesses.
And, come to think of it, too, Maya, all those things that we've been teased about that he said, the drug deal, all of that, which he's not denied.
He is not denied.
If the Senate does not have him testify, he can then later on this year come out with a book that says nothing. Oh, there was nothing. You can't sell a book that says nothing.
His book is clearly going to tell all.
So
that's clear.
So really it's just a question of whether Republicans want what he has to say out now, or do they want it to come out just before November? In the book.
Absolutely. Well, I think, and to your point, I think that senators are really, and we were having this conversation off air, Mitch McConnell is caught in a rock and a hard place. Not that I feel sorry for him.
No.
But he is caught. He's got the president on one hand pushing hard, pushing senators. He's both funding some of their campaigns. He's making it clear he'll bully them if they don't do what he wants. He has demanded both that they dismiss the case immediately. He's also demanded that they call witnesses, but he just wants his witnesses. He wants Hunter Biden. He wants Nancy Pelosi. He wants Joe Biden. He wants Adam Schiff, people who do not have direct evidence related to this impeachment. But that's what he wants. He wants either to get rid of it or a distraction. And the truth is, once the door is open to witnesses, the Republicans may well demand witnesses who aren't so relevant to the impeachment as a counterweight to the witnesses that would otherwise be subpoenaed, like a John Bolton. It'll be very interesting to see how this plays out. I'd still rather have that problem than not.
Yeah,
but
right.
Mitch McConnell both is trying to keep it short, sweet, simple, and move it along quickly, but he's also got the president kind of blowing him in the other direction.
In terms of the process and the trial, whatever witnesses are called, and let's say they get some of their off-the-wall witnesses they want that really aren't relevant.
By the way, I'll pay money if Adam Schiff testifies. I'll pay money for that.
Really?
He'll be a phenomenal witness.
Yeah.
I mean, this is actually the worst thing for them is to have Adam Schiff come and testify. Because while he is not a fact witness, he is absolutely on top of all the evidence and certainly would be a House manager.
Yeah.
So it'd be essentially like putting the prosecutor on the stand to make their case.
Yeah, which is also unheard of.
But
I guess they could.
If they want to make that mistake, they can make it.
Now, can senators ask any question they want? I know they have to write them down.
They can. There's no unless let me say it this way. There's a set of rules that governs impeachment that the Senate passed and amended years ago and then amended in 1986, and they govern this impeachment. But they're very skeletal. They're, when the articles come over, what's the oath, how much time passes, when and how the presiding officer convenes. It's very, very pro forma. It's very procedural. It doesn't answer the evidentiary questions. It does say the presiding officer will make sure subpoenas are issued, will make sure, it moves the way that senators have said it should move. The critical conversation that senators are going to have is exactly what we've been talking about, which is the rules they're going to adopt for the purposes of this specific trial. Mm-hmm. And that's the conversation about, are we going to allow witnesses or not, where it's pretty clear as of today, at least, what they're saying is, we will vote on whether to have witnesses. So witnesses will still be a possibility. We won't preclude them up front, but we will wait and hear from the House managers and then take a vote on whether or not to have witnesses. So it'll run something like that. And then the question is how many Republican senators will vote for witnesses at the end of that process.
Simple majority?
You need a simple majority. And that's why, there's been some debate about how many senators you need. You need 4. You need 4 to win a vote on witnesses. 4 Republican senators, yeah. You need 4 Republican senators to vote the other way. And that's a possibility. That is a distinct possibility because there are senators who are facing tough reelection bids.
Yeah.
They're up in 2020. And as we've said, a lot of people want to see witnesses. And I don't know if you saw it, but the newly formed Republican PAC that has formed by people like George Conway and Rick Wilson just ran their first attack ad in Colorado.
Yeah, I saw that. I did see that.
That
was
pretty
rough.
Tough ad.
It is a tough ad.
They call him impotent.
I wouldn't want to be on the other end of that.
I wouldn't want to be on the receiving end of that. So if you're in a tough race and you're essentially being called Donald Trump's person. I stopped myself, but you know what I was thinking.
Yeah, okay. Well, if you want to say it, you can say it. I mean, this is a podcast.
Kids.
Of course,
I gotta hold up a higher standard.
So, House managers, and I guess that would be unprecedented for a House manager to be called as a witness, let alone a member of the House. Period.
Correct.
That's incredible. But now, just like in the Clinton impeachment. There'll be attorneys for the defense.
Yes.
Now, do we know who that's going to be?
Yes. We know some of who that's going to be. So we know that the Cipollone, the White House counsel, is going to be on the defense team, and we know that Jay Sekulow, Donald Trump's longtime personal lawyer, is also going to be on the defense team.
Right.
Not very surprising and not atypical, by the way. Clinton had inside and outside as well.
Right,
so there's nothing unusual about that.
Right.
Except that Cipollone, remember, is the person who penned the letter to the House essentially saying they have no authority to ask for any witnesses or any documents related to the impeachment. It was an extreme position. It's one none of us believes even a conservative Supreme Court will uphold. And he will, I'm sure, assert a number of those arguments again if there are witnesses. So let me just explain how this would work. And the normal process would be you let the witness come. You can't block a witness in this case who is no longer an employee of the federal government from coming to testify.
Right.
In fact, you can't really block a witness who works for the federal government if they so choose to come and testify, as we saw. But usually the way it's supposed to work is they come to testify, and if the lawyer for the president believed the question to go into protected conversations, you assert the privilege on that question and ask that the witness not answer it. In other words, you go question by question.
Right.
In that scenario, what I would imagine is a Cipollone raising the privilege on every single question asked a John Bolton. Now you've got the Supreme Court Justice Roberts, sitting there, who then in that seat, as the presiding officer, has to make a judgment about whether or not the question should be answered. But remember that whatever the decision the justice makes, Republicans can call for a vote, and a simple majority of senators can then overrule the justice's decision.
That could be
crazy. It would be crazy. I'm not saying it would go down that way. But
I think it absolutely would.
But as we saw in the House, well, they'll want a little more decorum. They won't want to look like they're hiding every single thing, I think, than the House. But it could be a really messy, awful trial, even with witnesses, if they play that kind of hardball. And I believe that Cipollone has shown himself to be carrying Trump's water on making ridiculous and probably unconstitutional arguments.
So the Chief Justice has to so from the descriptions we're hearing about the Chief Justice role or lack thereof, I know if I was Chief Justice, I wouldn't want to go anywhere near it. I mean, it's just kind of silly.
Yeah.
You're a justice, you're trying to preside, and then whatever ruling you make can be overruled by a vote of the Senate.
Right. If you're Justice Roberts, I believe, and people are arguing different sides of this. I know some very smart, good lawyers that I respect who think Roberts is going to shake things up. I do not believe that. Justice Roberts has worked very hard his entire career to be politically neutral. Doesn't mean he doesn't have an ideology, but to steer clear of partisan politics. He's been very careful to do that during the Trump administration, even occasionally making statements that surprised us when he kind of came out to defend the court. And to do everything in his power to try to hold this court together in very fraught times and maintain its credibility to the American public when we have a president that's been attacking the federal bench when it doesn't rule his way. So that's not who Justice Roberts really is, and I don't think any Chief Justice would want to look very political sitting in that seat. Some of these questions may come before the Supreme Court. Some of those evidentiary questions could conceivably come before the Supreme Court. They all have not been answered by the Supreme Court. You
said a moment ago that you doubt even a conservative court would go against transparency, so to speak. You really believe that even with this court?
Blanket. So remember, let me say it this way. I'm not suggesting that this court would rule in all the ways I would if I were sitting on the bench. But there are two pieces of pretty strong precedent that say, yes, there is a thing called executive privilege. Yes, there are conversations and communications that a president gets to have and that they can assert privilege on. The court, but at the same time, they've said, but it's not absolute, and have forced, as we said, Nixon to turn over the Watergate tapes. They haven't ruled on this question per se because Donald Trump has made the argument so broad. But the idea that they would say that the president, at least with Justice Roberts, I'm not saying there wouldn't be some conservatives voting on the other side. I'm not saying unanimous. But it's hard for me to picture Justice Roberts, who has traditionally paid attention to their precedent, saying that a sitting United States president does not have to be accountable to Congress on an impeachment process, because that means what's left of impeachment.
Yeah.
You literally could just bar evidence from Congress in order to prevent yourself from being impeached. That would fly in the face of the balance of powers that the founders set up.
Yeah, I would think so. So the argument for privilege is just simply, I'm the president, and is it the same as arguing spousal privilege? You just, in general?
No, so this is the thing. You don't get to just argue it's just all privilege because I'm the president.
Okay.
So the way it works, executive privilege, remember there are a couple different kinds of privilege. One is attorney-client. That one is much clearer, right? And unless you've committed a crime and your lawyer has helped you, there are exceptions to it.
Right.
But certainly communications with your lawyer, if it's a personal lawyer, so a little more murky if it's a government lawyer, right? But still, there is some attorney-client privilege. That's one kind of privilege. That's not what's being alleged here, though. It's really, I as president, you don't get to know what my conversations are with my senior cabinet and with other arms of government. So you don't, and including my White House and the other parts of the executive branch, like Department of Defense, like OMB. You don't get to see any of that. Only I can decide whether or not you see any of that. Now, obviously, we've already seen if you file, there's a law. First of all, there's a law called the Freedom of Information Act law, right? So that's how we know some of the things that we've learned is because there is a law passed by Congress that says you have to turn over documents if they're fact documents. He's withholding facts. You can't withhold facts from the American public. Secondly, you're supposed to assert it based on the evidence. You can't, not just a blanket, it's all privileged. That's my point about it. It's very difficult to imagine the Supreme Court saying, yeah, you can just put a blanket privilege. You are allowed to protect conversations that are what we call deliberative, meaning if I'm White House counsel and you're the president, Mark, and we're having a conversation about whether or not it's lawful for me to freeze aid to Ukraine. And it's an open, honest conversation, and you want to have it be as free-wielding as possible to explore the law, the limits of the law, the gray areas. But it would look real bad in the public. You haven't made a decision, and it may not even been the basis of your decision. But it would make it look to the public like you were trying to skirt the law. And so in some of those instances, a court might say, no, you get to have an open, honest conversation where you're trying to understand what's permissible and what's not. But what you can't hide is the decision and the reason for the decision. You can just hide, because you don't want government not to have an honest conversation. So people think I'm your White House counsel, but I'm not going to answer your question honestly or at all because I know later it might be public and I just not going to like the way it's going to look, even if it's not wrong, even if it's not illegal, it's just not going to play well. If I'm saying, well, maybe it's legal if you do it this way, it may not be legal if you do it that way. Lawyers have those conversations with people all the time. In politics, it doesn't usually look that good. But the important thing is, what we have never heard why he says he froze Ukraine aid for different reasons at different times. We should see. So what's the reason? We should see all the documents around the reason, and we should see all the exchanges that show us facts. I think that's pretty straightforward. Yeah,
and it just seems to me, just as you said, and if a deliberative conversation could be argued on the grounds of privilege, and it could very well be embarrassing to him, but the fact of the matter is a lot of the information is already out in the public domain.
Exactly.
So if if that comes up, well, hey, Bo,
you don't have a reason for the privilege.
You don't have a reason for, and if you exert it, it makes you look even. That's me. That's even more embarrassing.
You just earned your honorary law degree because that's exactly right. That's exactly right, Mark. And see, I just want all audience to know it's really not. It's pretty straightforward. I will also say, because I don't want to confuse people to say that I'm arguing any of this would be legitimately privileged. You also don't. So it's out in the public. You can't say I don't want anyone to see this discussion. Even it's already out in the public. The second part is though it's an impeachment process. You don't get to keep your deliberate. If you're trying to deliberate about how you're going to abuse your power, you don't get to hide that, even if it's not a crime.
Right.
That's what Congress has authority to look into under the impeachment clause. So I have a hard time imagining that there's very much that would be legitimately withheld from the public or Congress. National security may be from the public, definitely not from Congress. And it's very hard to imagine what would be legitimately withheld even from the public.
Yeah.
At this point, just can't imagine it.
So
I just didn't want people to think there wasn't something called executive privilege that's real.
So I think we all would agree, even with witnesses, the likelihood of getting 2/3 of the Senate to vote for removal is slim. But as you have said here, and as Speaker Pelosi said over the weekend, he is impeached for life. That can never go away. So as an attorney and one who's looked at as a teacher and a professor in one, and thank you for my honorary degree too as well.
You're welcome.
That's as close as I'll come. I have to tell you the story about why I'm actually not a lawyer. But I was going in that direction. I was like, I went another way. But
well, we're glad you did.
Oh, well, thank you. So now there probably will not be that 2/3, but he'll have that moniker on him. So as you've looked at law over the years and looked at big stories and big cases like this, so I don't know whether you saw there was a Politico magazine headline where they interviewed some Republicans, and the headline was a quote from one of the people they interviewed, and several people agreed with this statement. It's referring to Trump. They said, "He is our OJ." That's what they. Now, so wait a minute.
So for the audience, I am shaking my head and rolling my eyes.
So at the very least, you're saying. So let's talk about what they think OJ was. That he was guilty and got away with it. So you're admitting that this is your guy.
He's our murderer.
Isn't that something to say?
He's our murderer. Keep your hands off our murderer.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which is, I never thought it was fair to put that on us. That was something that was projected on us anyways. Black folk, we just supported a murderer. But
and let's just be clear. What we were concerned about was FBI evidence and evidence tampering and actually doing what black people have had to, and many other people of color have had to suffer for a long time, which is, manufactured evidence.
Well, you know what I had to tell somebody on I'm sure you'll be amused by this. Every now and then I have to, channel my dear friend Dick Gregory, God rest his soul. And Dick used to say, he used to talk about the OJ trial. And he would say how, remember when the Bronco chase was happening? Everybody holding up the signs, "Run, OJ, run," were white. Yeah. Because OJ was never part of our community. We weren't with him.
And remember how slow he was driving.
That's right. So we were like,
he's not necessarily running.
Right, but it was after the other stuff, the police officers, the racist officers, the FBI. Yeah. Then black folks said, wait a minute, this is you on our street now, and we want this to be fair. Yeah. And then that turned into something else. Right. I don't see how they can draw. It's a dangerous analogy to draw.
That's right, and unfortunately, I think OJ did it. And should have been held to account. And it was unfair, bad law enforcement is the reason that he didn't. But what I would say here is, you don't argue for your murderer. That doesn't bode well. I think Nancy Pelosi said it yesterday. She said there will be a price to pay for Republican votes.
Yeah.
And there should be, because, again, it's not whether or not. It's ultimately let the evidence play out, bring it forward. Stand up for the constitutional balance of powers. It's central to our democracy. Don't let any sitting president say, "No, you can't have. You don't have any sunlight. The American people have no sunlight." Then, when you vote, take your oath seriously. Mm-hmm. Vote the evidence and vote your conscience. And if you do that, and you vote, and you think there's a good, strong argument for why it's not impeachable, I'm not going to agree with you, but there are sometimes principled positions that are different. But make sure that the American public can make their own decision based on facts.
Yeah.
Because we have nothing left if we can't trust our government to pull the facts forward and let us as citizens who have to register a vote make the decision.
If we don't have facts, what do we have?
That's right.
People talk about post-racial.
Oh,
I don't agree with post-racial. I think we are seemingly in a post-factual environment.
Yes, we've gone. Yeah, we certainly are. And I think it's also why. Last thing I'll say is back to the House Democrats: subpoena, 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 fight in court, every last one, because we deserve to know.
Which reminds me, before I forget, I meant to bring this up earlier, real quick. The ruling by Ketanji Brown Jackson, the judge,
yes,
is what is standing now as the order of the day. And she said that, if I'm not mistaken, there could not be blanket privilege. Yes. Now, the judge that Bolton was waiting to hear from, he was kind of hiding behind his associate, Kupperman, I believe, one of his deputies.
And then they pulled back Kupperman's subpoena so that
right.
Well, put it this way. They did not want to conflate different issues.
Right.
They wanted to keep it neat and clean so they could keep it moving.
So the judge just ruled that moot.
That's
when it was pulled back, it was moot.
That's right. They have a federal decision that will be appealed, and the McGahn decision will be appealed. It's not that it's not going to go up the chain, but there's no reason for them not to subpoena and fight and let these go up the chain.
Right.
Plus, you might get some of them. You might get some of them sooner as opposed to later.
Well, and that's all the more reason why what Bolton said and why there should be follow-up on that. The Bolton, he didn't have to do that. He could have just stood his ground and been quiet about it.
And waited and said, I'm going to wait for a Supreme Court decision.
So he kind of went off script. I mean, Trump, after all, killed Soleimani for him because that's what he wanted. Let's be honest.
Yes, he did.
And then the next day, he's like, "Okay, I'm ready to testify." So I'm sure Trump's like, "Wait a minute, dude, that's not the way this. That's not the deal." So
yes. Yeah,
this will be very. I seem to remember the Clinton trial being very boring and drawn out and procedural.
They had.
Ooh.
Well, this is why Nancy Pelosi said, "I don't want to announce my House managers till I see what kind of trial it's going to be."
Yeah.
Clinton, by the way, did have witnesses. They had witness depositions that were just behind closed doors.
Right, correct.
Which,
correct.
In that kind of case where it's about people's sexual relationships, it was a very different impeachment.
Yeah.
It's not about whether and look, even though Bill Clinton was acquitted, he has lived his entire life since that, living with that impeachment.
And forever will.
And forever will. And everybody knows he had that affair. Everybody knows he tried to obstruct. I mean, let's go down the list. There's not a lot to defend.
And they even, honestly, they're going to do a surviving Bill Clinton like surviving R. Kelly.
That's
so, I mean, he's paying a price.
That's absolutely right. And
Trump shouldn't?
And Trump will too. But I think other politicians who protect him will also pay some form of price.
Yeah, they ought to see that.
And certainly they'll pay the price of their reputation in history.
Yeah. And those depositions were prior to the impeachment vote, or were they?
Correct. So remember, yes. So they had that was the other difference between the previous impeachments of Nixon and Clinton, is that there were full on prosecutorially run grand jury in the case of Clinton, because you had special prosecutor, independent prosecutors, special prosecutors running prosecutorial investigations. So that has not happened here. And it's not happened here for a whole bunch of reasons we all know. But it means that the House, their job was essentially to do that investigation, and they were blocked. Yeah.
Maya Wiley here, our very special guest. We will see what happens on next week, and hopefully we can keep you close by.
I will be right up the street in what I hope will be a front row seat to watching our Constitution get the protection it deserves, so that we the people get the protection we deserve.
Right, and that's the kind of the process we deserve. And I know I speak on behalf of everybody. Really enjoy your commentary and your wisdom. Thank you so much. Thank you for being here.
Back at you.
All right, Maya Wiley, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.